You gonna start?
Yep, we're live. All right, welcome everybody to the second session of the Ubuntu Online Summit. This is going to be writing your own Juju Charms. So in the past, writing your own Juju Charm was really kind of a convoluted, well, I don't want to say too convoluted. One of the great things about Juju Charms is you can do whatever you want, right? A charm effectively runs as root on the instance. Well, this is really great if you know what you're doing. We've got a bunch of feedback that people were saying, you know what, I need a little bit of structure to this. So we spent some time and making a bunch of helper tools to kind of give people that, here's what a decent Python charm looks like. Here's what a decent chef charm looks like. Here's what a decent puppet one looks like. And then at some point, Cory and Ben had this great idea of why don't we just give people recomposable layers of common things. They can add their bits, and then we can just charm build, and then we'll auto-generate a charm for you that's really nice and has best practices, and then we'll just maintain the layers, the common bits, as a community as a whole. That way, charm authors can get the benefits of this. So that's how I understand how building charms is. So with that, Cory's going to take over and kind of gives you guys a heads up with this. One of the things I really love for those of you who aren't, if you're writing charms the traditional way, writing charms this way will save you a ton of time, a ton of lines of code. They are now very simple, very easy to use. So we're going to go through a PHP example, I think, here. And I just want to keep in the back of your mind how simple this is to build charms these days. So with that, Cory, take it away.
Sure. So just to kind of expand a little bit on what you were saying, traditional charming involves some events that come in from the Juju system that your charm responds to, things like the install hook, the config option changing, a relation being added, and those events are what you need to kind of describe the life cycle of the service, but it doesn't really give you enough fine-grained control to kind of describe what the various steps that the charm needs to perform in a meaningful, easy to follow manner. And then the other issue that you pointed out is that we have a lot of common code among charms that would be nice to be able to be reused. And doing that in libraries when charms are in multiple different languages and everything has proven difficult. So we came up with this strategy of building charms from layers, composing them, kind of somewhat similar to the idea of how Docker images are built from layers, but more oriented towards the software that charms are. And then to glue the various layers together, we tried to extend the idea of the event system and add the concept of semantically meaningful events. So you can essentially define your own states or events that your charm can respond to that give you a lot more fine-grained control over where you are in your charm lifecycle. Before I get started, this example is pretty much going to be walking through the getting started documentation with building charms for layers, which I will now put a link to in the IRC. So we're basically going to be following along with that. This example is going to be, the charm's going to be written in Python. We made a point to make this system kind of framework, I suppose, have hooks so you could use it from a command line interface. So it, just like Juju, because it uses a command line interface, it can be used from any languages. And we have bindings to make charms written in Bash look almost identical to the charms written in Python, but they're in Bash and using Bash functions. But the decorators, which I'll get to in a bit, look very similar. Another point that I'd like to make is that not only can individual layers be written in different languages, but charms built from various languages or from various layers, each layer can be in its own language. And as long as they use the same state subsystem, the reactive pattern, they can communicate with each other and kind of organize and work together cooperatively, and you don't have to worry about what language a given layer is written in. You can write your layer in the language that is appropriate. Although the bindings that we have are definitely easiest to use in Python and Bash, but there's some work in creating wrappers for the command line interface in some other languages. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen here. If I can find the right window, I believe this is it. Okay, is that, George, can you tell me if that's large enough to read? Okay, good. All right, so first of all, like in traditional charming, we're going to have this is our charm repository directory, which is...
Actually, if you can hit enter a few times, there's a Google logo that it's superimposed.
Okay, so when you're starting a charm, you have to create a charm repository directory. And then that's your Juju repository, and that it just tells your local Juju where to find your locally developed charms. The pattern in this layered setup is to have, I like to have a layers directory, and then there's an layer path that tells the charm build system where to find the layers. It is essentially the same as, if you don't set this, it will default to the Juju repository. So it will generally work as you expect, but it can be useful to set that layer path environment variable. So clearing that, so we're in the layers directory. We don't have anything, so we're gonna make a new charm. This is for the vanilla PHP message board site. And again, this is from the getting started example. So the things that we need to make a charm, and this is going to be a charm layer. So we're going to we need a metadata.yaml. So that is required for all charms. A layer, if you're creating a charm layer, then you need a metadata.yaml. If you're creating a base layer, which I might talk about in a little bit, in other words, a layer that other charms are built off of, you may or may not need to include that. Let me, okay, so in the metadata.yaml, you're going to need things like the name of the charm, in this case, vanilla, the description, the summary of the charm, which is vanilla forum, maintainer, and so on. That more importantly, though, as if you watch George's talk, something that is important to make a charm that really functions together with other charms to provide a real service is the relationship. So the vanilla software requires a database, and it's going to use MySQL. So we're just telling it that we are going to connect to the MySQL charm, or any charm that supports the MySQL interface, and use that as our database. With traditional charming, you would have to then go look up what the how to use the MySQL interface, and it's not well documented, unfortunately. But so it might involve looking at some example charms. There's plenty of charms out there that use MySQL interface, and it's not too complicated, so it's not too big of a deal. But one of the really nice things about this layered approach is that we can reuse the work that is done to kind of wrap the interface in a reusable API. So let me go ahead and split. So the file that I'm going to start creating now is layer.yaml, which this tells the charm build system what layers to include to build up your charm. So obviously the layer that we're writing right now, and we want to tell it that we're going to use the interface MySQL. And this will pull in the interface layer for the MySQL interface, which kind of wraps that communication protocol that is needed to kind of negotiate or establish that the connection is ready with the MySQL service and acquire all the connection information, like the host name, the port, user, and password database and such.
Yep. And now would be a good time to interrupt you. I'm putting the URL where you can see the list of all the interfaces in IRC, which is interfaces.juju.solutions.
And there is the link to that. Unfortunately, it doesn't directly expose the READMEs here yet, although that is the plan. But on the list of those interfaces, if you click on the repo, so like if you click on the MySQL Juju relation MySQL interface here, the README includes information about what states or events this interface layer sets and how you access the information. It's got some example code on how you might use it. So this lets you, it gives you a single place to go to kind of discover new layers and interfaces, and we're making a big push to keep these well documented in the READMEs so that you can easily see what what states you need to react to and what how you would use that. So going back to here, so the other thing that we need, since this is an Apache PHP mod PHP application, we don't want to, we would prefer not to have to do all of the setup of installing Apache, installing mod PHP, knowing how to configure it, because that's not really relevant to the charm that we're creating. What the charm we're creating is setting up the vanilla forum software. So it'd be nice if we had a layer that could do all that Apache PHP stuff for us, and there is such a layer created for this example. So all we have to do is tell the charm build system that we want to include the layer, the Apache PHP layer, and that will give us a system, a base layer that will set up Apache, and link directly to the documentation here in IRC.
And while you're doing that, I just want to interrupt to just kind of point out how powerful this is. This is really neat because people would, when they're making charms, because charms let you do what you want, people would be configuring Apache and PHP slightly different ways, right? And the whole idea behind charms is for reusability, right? So while charms as a whole were reusable in Lego pieces, inside of charms we started to get a bunch of complexity, and it was like, wouldn't it be neat if we would just have one really awesome way to do Apache and PHP for LAMP apps, right? And then in the future, as that gets improvements and updates, all the charms that use that layer benefit, as opposed to, hey everybody, there's a new version of Ubuntu. Everyone who did Apache, you have to go and make these fixes, to all the charms that use Apache because of these, this best practice has changed, or they're recommending this instead. If we do that at the layer level now, everyone who's writing Apache PHP charms can just reuse that layer. So that's really, really powerful stuff. That's my favorite part right there. Just my little comment. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. That's a good point that's a good benefit to point out, because I don't think we talk about that when we're so happy with how easy it makes charming. It's important to point out that it also gives us consistency. Okay, so now this is in fact all that we need here to tell the charm build system that we want to use these layers, and it will automatically pull those in when we type charm build. So we are actually pretty well on our way to having a fully functional charm. I believe I could charm build this right now and deploy it, and it would work. Although obviously it wouldn't install the vanilla forum software. It would, however, set up Apache and have mod PHP installed and ready for when we want to react to that. So let's get to the heart of the reactive style charms, and that is we create a reactive directory, and this is instead of in traditional charms you would create a hooks directory and respond to the Juju lifecycle hooks. With the layered and reactive approach, The Apache PHP layer is the one that's going to respond to the lifecycle events and expose more targeted, meaningful events like the Apache is ready. The MySQL interface layer will, surface events like the MySQL database is connected and available. And so we can respond just to those instead of the, more general and kind of vague and harder to respond to lifecycle events. It kind of, filters those down into the specific events that we actually really care about. So in the reactive directory, we're going to create a vanilla, and this can be called whatever you want. Any files under the reactive directory are going to be automatically searched for handlers. And these handlers, again, can be Python files that use the reactive decorators, which I'll show in a minute, or they can be just any executable that follows a specific command line protocol of accepting a --test argument to indicate that they should test whether that handler should be run, and then a --invoke that actually executes the handler. That's all documented on the reactive documentation, which let me provide a link to that real quick. There we go. And so we're going to use Python because it's a little bit easier for me to work with, and that's what my example is built in currently. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is import some helpers from Charms Reactive, import when and not. And these are our decorators that allow us to kind of respond to the states that the various other layers set. So I'm just going to stub out these first real quick. So the first thing to figure out what states we need to respond to, we know that our database, we have an Apache layer that could be available or not. We have a database layer that could be available or not. So we know that it might be the case that when not, we might have, let's go with the common case. We know that we expect an Apache to be available at some point and the database to be available at some point. And once those two things are satisfied, we can set up vanilla. Now, the functions are going to be passed arguments based in Python based on the relations. Any relation state will pass in the relation class instance for that relation. So we're going to get a database, we can call it MySQL, class instance so that we can use it to access the connection information off of that database. So for right now, we're just going to pass on this because we'll worry about how to actually fill that in a minute. Hold on 1 second. All right. So the other thing that we might, the other set of states that we might encounter is if Apache is available, but the database is not. We can actually say, let's say the database is not even connected. So in this case, we have Apache is all set up, but we're still waiting for MySQL to be connected. And this allows us a really clean and easy way to hook into the new extended status system. So from charm helpers.core hookend import status. And this is something that's somewhat new. It's been around for a couple of releases for Juju, I think. But it allows us to report to the user exactly what we're waiting on or what our status is. And we can say, please add relation to MySQL. And this allows us to tell the user that we can't do anything until they perform this action. And that's a really powerful ability to communicate with the user and provide them with feedback on exactly what they need to do to move the charm service along into an available state. Another state that we might encounter is if the database is connected. Database available. So the database might be connected, but not yet ready. It hasn't provided us the connection information, and we can report that to the user as a waiting state. Waiting for MySQL. So this allows us to differentiate between the state of we're blocked awaiting user intervention, or we expect it to get itself sorted out on its own, and we just are letting them know that it's not ready yet, but it will be shortly. So that's a really powerful ability, and these states allow us to very easily kind of expose that information to the user in a easy to follow way. Okay, so the other thing that could happen is Apache could be started. So the Apache layer by default doesn't start Apache until you tell it to, because it assumes that you're going to need to, like we are going to do, install some web applications or websites, and it knows that you'll need time to kind of get that configured. So it tells you that Apache is available and then waits for you to set the Apache started state. In this case, once we know that Apache is started, we can tell the user that we are ready. We should also in here, if we are not waiting, if we're still waiting on MySQL, we should set state. So this is how we set these reactive states. Like this is exactly how the layers would set them as well. And we can tell it that Apache.start, except that we don't actually want to set that state here, and we want to remove it. So this is telling, this is how we tell the Apache layer that we are not ready for Apache to start. We want it to, we don't want it to start. So if it was started before, we need to shut it down because we've somehow lost our MySQL database, and we need to wait for it to come back before we can have Apache running. You could do some more complex or intelligent things here, such as injecting a this site is currently down page or something like that. But it gives you the kind of power and flexibility to handle these different cases, and it's very easy to kind of follow what is triggering these particular behaviors. So okay, so now we've got all of the additional states that we could respond to. We need to fill in the actual everything is ready. Let's let's kind of do that. And I'm gonna for brevity's sake, I think I'm gonna copy and paste this in from our existing example. So what this is doing is rendering a template. We need to define the configuration file for vanilla, and the easiest way for us to do that, rather than writing it out by hand, is to use a Jinja template, and this is built into charm helpers or just templating. That's built into charm helpers, which gets included. It's a Python library to with a lot of helpers to make charming easier, and it gets included automatically from our base layers. We don't have to worry about managing that dependency, just like we don't have to worry about managing the charms reactive dependency. It's all kind of provided automatically from the base layer. So we're telling it to take this template file, which we haven't created yet, render it out to this location using these file permissions and giving it the MySQL interface as this DB variable, so it can access those properties. Then a bit more setup. We want to make sure our various directories have the right permissions and such, and then we tell it to start Apache. So the thing that we're missing, seem to be missing here, is actually installing the vanilla software. How do we get that onto the system, and how do we tell Apache where it is and all that stuff? Well, that's kind of built into the Apache PHP layer. It has a configuration file that it can drive itself from that will tell it where to get the information, where to download it. So, oops, I forgot some imports here. Import.
And one thing I'd like to add is the reason I kind of like really love that the charm is basically this now is that it makes it really obvious just from glancing at it what the charm does, right? Before, I'd see a charm and I go into the hooks directory and I would go into an install hook, then I would go into config. You know, this kind of gives you, and there'd be a pile of hooks in there, a lot of them symlinked to like one big file. It was confusing. You know, this kind of tells you exactly what's happening in each little bit, right? And then it tells you which layer it's interacting with, right? Which I think is conceptually, I think is really good because it kind of really explains at a higher level what the charm does without needing to get, you know, when databases connect, you know, do this with Apache, right? As opposed to me going to dig into the actual bits that do that, right? Which I don't really care about. I just need to know that when, you know, that database is connected, this XYZ fires off without having to go find out what XYZ are. Obviously, I'd want to do that eventually, but from a top level, it's almost like a self-documenting README, which I really like.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes it a lot easier to follow what the charm's doing, and honestly, it makes it a lot less error-prone as well. One thing that we encounter time and time again with charms before these frameworks were created is that you have the lifecycle events of Juju where you have a relation that gets might get connected or something might change on a relation. You might have to deal with a couple of different relations for your charm. It's pretty common to interact with multiple different services, or even just one service and some config values. And since there's no guarantee, there's no possible way that there could be a guarantee about which of these hooks will fire in what order, because you never know what order the user is going to add your relations. You can never really be sure at what point you're going to end up with all of the bits of information that you need in order to reliably set up your application. In this case, we have the database available. We might potentially have some sort of required config parameter, like say an admin password or a site host name or something like that, that is required before we can start this application. And we don't know which one of those can become available first. They might add the relation first and then set the config, or they might set the config and then add the relation. And with the lifecycle events, it's you have your logic spread out among a couple of different hooks, and you have to then coordinate between the hooks to figure out which one is actually the one that is triggered last, and how now it needs to call the logic to set up and start the application. And it can very quickly get into race type conditions or communication mismanagement conditions where your charm thinks that it should be in one state and it's actually in another, and it can lead to subtle errors that people often don't realize they have, and that only show up in corner cases. So this kind of allows us to kind of capture all that complexity and only expose the these combinations of states or these individual states when they're appropriate, and then react to the combination of states that actually tells us what we need, what state we're in overall. So All right, so we've got our code here that assumes that we've got the vanilla software downloaded and installed in the right place, but we need to tell the Apache PHP layer how to do that. So we're going to add one more configuration file here, apache.yaml, and we're going to tell it a few things, that the Apache PHP layer, a few things about what we need to have set up. So one thing that we need to tell it is that we need a couple of additional packages on top of just the base Apache packages. So we want PHP 5 MySQL, and we want PHP 5 GD. This will tell the Apache PHP layer to add those additional packages and install them while it's setting up Apache. We define a site, vanilla. This is just what we're going to call our site, so this is kind of controlling the vhost entry in the Apache config, if you think of it like that. So we can set some options like indexes and follow symlinks, which is not really necessary for our app. Well, it might be for vanilla, multi-views, something like that. So we can also, importantly, tell the Apache PHP layer where do we want to install this our website from, and pasting this in here. So this is telling it to fetch it from GitHub download. It's got SHA-256 checksum embedded in the URL, which the Apache PHP layer will validate to confirm that there were no issues when downloading the file, and that it's the file that we expect. So it's more secure, and that's kind of just all built into this URL and the Apache PHP layer. And this is all that we need to do to tell that layer how to install that, and then the code that we wrote before will set that up. So the one piece I think that we're still missing is that template file. We need to set up the configuration source. So let's create a templates directory, and what do we call that? Vanilla config, I think. PHP. And again, I'm just going to copy this from the existing examples for brevity. So if you recall, let me this. See this. So this we passed in the MySQL interface as a variable called db. And so then we can use that in this template, db.host, db.database, db.user, db.password, to set up these config options. And that makes it really easy to render this config. And I believe that's just about everything that we need to deploy this. We can certainly try building it and try giving it a go anyway. Okay, so anything that is strictly necessary? I don't think so. So we'll just try building it. So when you type charm build, it tells you where it's composing into. It pulls in all the various layers. Basic is the layer that Apache PHP is built on, and that pulls in the ultra common stuff like the reactive, charms.reactive and charm helpers and that sort of thing. You'll notice that it also pulled in a HTTP interface. That's provided by the Apache PHP layer automatically, and it allows us to, without doing anything in our charm layer, Apache PHP knows that, you know, since it's serving website, it could support load balancing, reverse proxying, or whatever. So it just kind of sets that up for you automatically. And so if we want, we can go down here into trusty, which is where it put it, and then it built it in here, and it created our charm. You can do charm layers. You kind of get Matt points out that I need to have Juju repository set to build in the right directory. I did mention that at the beginning, but it's good to recap. you do have to have Juju repository set. One downside to this charm layers currently is that these dependencies are kind of cluttering things up, but we're going to resolve that here in the near future. But I wanted to come back up here to the top and point out that you'll notice that these color-coded sections tell you exactly where each file comes from, what layer, whether it's from the basic layer, the PHP in green, the vanilla layer, which is our layer in teal or cyan, the MySQL interface in purple, and so on. And you can see each file is then color-coded from where it came from, so it allows you to easily tell, where these various bits are coming from. You can see that the MySQL interface layer has added our hooks for us to handle the database relation lifecycle events. It also adds some additional code in here for the HTTP interface. And if we scroll down, there'd be website relation lifecycle events that are handled by the Apache PHP layer. You'll notice it also added config YAML. So let's jump down here. Let's cat config YAML. The port. Now that's we didn't do anything to manage on our own the port that Apache is going to be listening on, but it by default provides you with a config variable that allows you to set that yourself or for the end user to change it as they need to. The metadata. Notice the metadata has our name and summary, etc. But it also has the HTTP interface, so that's all kind of merged together from the during the build process. So, all right, so let's try deploying this. Let's see. Description expected, got nothing. Okay.
Yeah, you have to have something in there, I think.
Okay, let's go back.
It's just a forum, yeah.
Okay, so we go back to our, so real quick, I just want to point out, you don't want to, you pretty much never want to edit the built charm directly. Instead, what you want to do if you encounter an error is you'll want to go back to your layer directory and edit that, and then once you've made the change, I think we might also need a tags. So, and then you just run charm build again, and it updates the built charm based on the changes that you made.
I'm just thinking aloud here real quick while this build process is happening, which is quite fast. Let's assume then that we have 100 charms using PHP Apache or PHP Nginx or whatever this layer is. When you update the layer, what happens? Does everyone need to go rebuild charms, or are we going to have a method? I'm trying to think of how we notify charm authors that the layers are moving underneath them. Yeah.
Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to point out is that we do not expect there to be that many base layers. What we're envisioning for the base layers, like Apache PHP, is to have them essentially be kind of runtime layers. It's the the kind of general framework that you want an application set up in, whether it's Apache or maybe a Docker-based app to kind of make it easy to deploy Dockerized applications. Maybe a Ruby Rails framework or runtime that we don't expect to have a whole slew of them. We don't want charms built on layers to be automatically updated because there might be incompatible changes in the layer. They might expose new states that you might need to react to, or they might deprecate old states. So we don't want them automatically updated. But anytime that you go in and do a charm build, it will pull down the latest version. And I think we're going to add version ranging in there, like you can do with semantically versioned libraries, so that we can adjust for incompatible updates, and that sort of thing.
Right. It feels to me like when whoa, is that my delay?
I'm not hearing it.
Continue. I'll ask at the end.
Okay, sure. Anyway, yeah. So when a layer is updated, you will have to, each individual charm that uses that layer will have to be rebuilt. But those, that all that entails is doing the charm build again. And we expect to have more intelligent tooling that will kind of give more information about, oh, this layer is updated and it exposes these new states, but it's still kind of in progress. So let's try and deploy this. Local trusty vanilla. Let it go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and kick off the status watch status format tabular, which I know you used in the previous. Is very useful, particularly with these charms that use the extended status to kind of watch what the charm is doing as it progresses. And you can see that it's mentioning it's installing the packages, and it should in a moment go to a state where it says that it needs its MySQL. Since the Apache layer doesn't depend on anything, it's going to probably install Apache and PHP. It should download and fetch the form software, but since it's missing the MySQL, it won't actually set up and configure and start the vanilla software. So I'm not sure how long this will take, but hopefully it's not too long. So something you might notice in the top of my window, might be blocked by the Google logo, but if you haven't used it before, there's a debug tool called Juju's Sync Watch, and that allows you to essentially watch it, set it up, run it to watch a charm directory for changes. So if you have any issues with your charm, once you do the rebuild or make your changes, it can automatically get pushed up to your broken instance and have that hook retried, so you can kind of develop locally and have it kind of update and fix the issues on the remote server. It's a very powerful tool. I'm hoping I won't need it, but let me see if I can run a Juju debug log and see. This will show us exactly what's going on. It's doing some apt installing. Installing PHP now. Oh, and you can see here on the Apache PHP layer provides some additional extended status support. It now tells us that it's installing the vanilla software and configuring, and now it tells us that we are missing the relation to MySQL. So very useful information. We know that we now need to go over here and Juju deploy MySQL. Probably should have done that before. I don't know how long this will take, but and then Juju add relation MySQL and vanilla. Oh, apparently I can't type, so that's fine. And now if we go over here, we should watch. So we notice the workload is blocked here. It means that it hasn't yet seen that I added the relation, but once the hook executes. Here we go. Now it's in maintenance, means it's, or that's MySQL. I'm not sure why sometimes the adding the relation, it doesn't trigger that. I think it has to do with the local provider and how it schedules hook execution, but there we go. It's now, that's not right. In the world. There we go. Not sure how that display got corrupted, but it looked like it had two MySQLs. There we go. So now it's switched over to waiting status because the MySQL hasn't provided the connection info that it's waiting for. And as you can see, I'm actually really surprised. Everything worked perfectly. So, so now it's got the connection information.
Don't be too surprised.
Well, I mean, given how error-prone Charming, at least my Charming, because I tend to make mistakes. Doing it with the layers and reactive states makes it so much clearer what's happening that it's a lot easier to avoid making mistakes. So.
Right.
So now that was all we needed to create a charm that installed vanilla forum software on with Apache PHP and get it up and running. Now it's should be listening on port 80. We could add an HTTP proxy here if we wanted to, HTTP proxy.
Which you recommend doing so you can get that nice horizontal scalability out of it.
And again, because we use the Apache PHP layer, we didn't have to do anything ourselves to support that. It just comes out of the box from Apache PHP. And,
right. Yeah, I was bringing up the maintenance because when we went from 1204 to 1404, the behavior in Apache changed, and we had to touch a bunch of charms.
Right.
To do that, so I envision that rebuilding your charm with layers would happen. Not weekly or anything, but just as part of like a usual kind of there's a major update to one of the distros that Juju uses, right? Whether that's a major release of CentOS or Ubuntu or something, where you're getting a new upstream version of that software, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely seems like a good practice, and it's because it's just a simple charm build. You could have integrate this with the CI that just says charm runs charm build and then deploys the charm and tests it with an amulet test and confirms that it's still working. And if it is, it can you could even automatically push that up to the store. Yeah, so it definitely streamlines the maintenance process there. But again, it does have to be done for each individual charm because if something does change,
right,
it might require code changes in the charm itself. So I think that's it, and we're pretty close to time.
Yeah, that's it. But I was going to say it's a lot better to rebuild a bunch of charms than to go back, figure out how that guy used Apache, right, which is going to be different depending on one guy writes his a certain way and one guy writes his a certain way, and that was a really tough transition. That was a lot of engineering hands-on where rebuilding I'm trying to think because now with Ubuntu doing a 1604 this cycle I think the push there is just move as many charms you can to the framework and then it just becomes a rebuild and test as opposed to figure out and I'm already seeing just by looking at the charms the Apache layer I can see stuff that you were doing with Apache that I wasn't doing. I was like, I wonder if I'm supposed to do it that way because I haven't touched it in a while. So I think that's good once we get the experts, especially weighing in on the layers themselves.
Yeah,
everyone can benefit, right?
Yeah, one of the major ideas behind Juju and Charming is that you want to have the people who are experts in the software, in their software, writing the charms to manage it because they know how to set that up, how to configure it best. And this, breaking charms apart into layers, again, allows even more focus. The people who know how to set up Apache can write that layer, and the people who know how to configure vanilla or what have you can write that layer and be focused on the part that they actually know about. We actually had a question in IRC from Lazy Power. He asked, the build process is an add-only process. If I rebuild and I've removed a file and interface, etc., does it reflect in the build charm? I believe that is it is true that it is add-only. There'll probably be the case. We may, this tooling is still a little bit new, so we will probably kind of consider these things. We want to be careful about removing files in general, but if we can reliably tell that a file was removed from a layer, then it will probably make sense. But because charm build is just pulls in all the layers, you could always potentially just delete your built charm and rebuild from scratch. You shouldn't make changes to it, so that should end you up with basically the same result. So it should be an idempotent process. So.
Right. So we have PHP. If you haven't looked at the list yet, we also have Node.js. That means if you're looking for something to contribute, we can just start your favorite PHP apps, your favorite Node.js apps, get them in there. I mean, it's, I don't want to say almost trivial compared to the old way, but a lot easier, a lot less error prone. So thank you very much for writing this, Cory. I realized the power of this a lot later than everyone else on the team, and when I got it, I was like, ding. Like it's nice.
Yeah, it's a concept that is. I think it's easy to grasp, and yet at the same time, if you're mired in if you've been doing a lot of existing charming and you just have it explained to you until you really see it in practice, in action, it's not as clear what the benefit is. As soon as you see it in action, I think it's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. So, and with that ends the session. Thank you very much, Cory. You can find us on #Juju on Freenode, and as always, we're more than happy if you need help learning this technology. If you get us more than 2 or 3 people, we're more than happy to have these kind of sessions for you and your team. So if you're considering using Juju at work or any organization that's deploying things to a cloud, we'd be more than happy to help you out with this stuff. Our whole job is to make tools like this to make it easy for you to iterate really quickly in the cloud. That's why we exist. So with that, thanks, Cory, and we'll see. There's going to be Jane's Q&A here at the top of the hour. We'll see everyone on the flip side of the hour with our other sessions. We still got Kubernetes and big data to show you guys today, and it should be a lot of fun. So with that, thank you very much.